podcast is part of the Batman Universe Podcast Network, hosted by thebatmanuniverse.net. Here, we love talking about everything Batman. The BatmanUniverse.net has news, original content, and reviews about Batman comics, movies, TV shows, video games, and more. Check out the BatmanUniverse.net and join our Discord server to start chatting with fellow fans. We can't wait to talk to you guys. Also, visit our Patreon page and join our other awesome supporters. But enough of this nonsense. On with the show.
Hey, Bat fans. Welcome to the Batman Universe Podcast, episode 251. I'm your host, Scott, and joining me are co-hosts BJ and Adil. Today, we're devoting a whole episode to Batman Year One, the book, the animated feature film, and references in other Bat films. Why? Because DC currently has a 3-issue arc in the pages of Batman called Joker Year One. We won't spoil that storyline or discuss it here. You can always listen to our comic podcast for that. The Batman Universe Comic Podcast. It's our sister podcast, or we're the sister podcast. Either way, we play well with each other and we focus on different areas of Batman-related media. Or if you're curious, you can also read our reviews of Joker Year One, which are all on the BatmanUniverse.net. But because this is a hot topic right now, this type of storyline, there's no perfect time to revisit this seminal classic, and I'm glad to have BJ and Adil with me as we dive right in. So no icebreaker this episode, just because we kind of have a lot of ground to cover when I started mining this. So before we start talking about this, some quick, fast facts on this. So Batman Year One is a 4-issue arc printed in 1987 in the pages of Batman issues 404 through 407. Written by Frank Miller, art by David Mazzuchelli. I probably butchered that name. Apologies if I did. It's often considered the best Batman story ever made. There actually are a couple people on our staff, too, at TBU who would agree with that consensus that I know of right off the bat. Released the following year after The Dark Knight Returns, so it kind of plays off of that and that tone and the mood Frank Miller created in the previous major Batman story he made. With the release of Joker Year One, which I mentioned earlier, there are currently 23 Year One storylines, some which are considered canon and some that aren't. And that includes Gotham City Year One, which came out last year. And the success of Batman Year One also led to Year Two and Year Three storylines, which I can't say I've read Year Three, but I do like Year Two, and there's some things that come out of it that we mentioned in a previous episode, our Mask of the Phantasm episode, because there was a major character that was readapted for that film from Batman Year Two. But anyways, back to Batman Year One. So to start us off, BJ and Adil, where does this fall on your ranking?
All right, so I'm going to come out a little bit hot, but I recognize its importance, Batman Year One's importance as a storyline, but it's not very high on my rankings. So I'm coming out a little, I don't know if that's a hot take, but just not I understand, like I said, I understand its importance. I know why it's there. It's my favorite Batman origin story, but it's just not one I revisit a lot.
So I think we're starting off with the spicy takes, because I'm going to agree with that. And I'm going to disagree with some of the people on our server who, I know who they are too. But I think, just like BJ said, I really understand why this is considered a classic, and I agree. I consider it a classic myself. I do think it is one of those quote-unquote definitive origin stories. However, the quality of the actual book itself is not one that I would place in my top 5 or anything like that. I think I read it again just before this podcast, but I also reviewed the rating that I had given it the very first time I read it, and it was a 4 out of 5, which is pretty good, but it's not a 4.5 or a 5 that would put it in my top 5 or top 10. So yeah, I'm definitely with BJ on that.
That's interesting. All right. We actually might have a less contentious episode than I was wondering because I am a serial Goodreads logger. So I also reread this book within the past week and I gave it a 4 out of 5 again after my initial score of 4 out of 5. People can go check my Goodreads and it's there. And I'm kind of in agreement with you guys. We'll get into the details in a second. I don't want to explain my opinion on it, but I sit on the fence this one. I like it. I respect it, but it's never my go-to. I probably haven't read this since the first time I read it years ago. So it was kind of interesting to go back with that fresh take and relearn some of the little motifs and things that I forgot about when I think about what the story actually is, what my memory remembers the plot being. So with that said, what are some elements you like about Batman Year One?
I would probably say just the overall grittiness of the story. It's very, very down to earth. Like there's no fantastical elements there's really not any fantastical elements. I think it showed kind of very much restraint that there were no other than Catwoman. There were no other costumed villains. We didn't get a Joker reference till the very, very end. And nowadays, if you compare it to Zero Year, the Scott Snyder story, that had all the fantastical elements. That had the Red Hood gang, that had the Riddler, that had Dr. Death, right? If I'm remembering correctly. But Year One, it was as down to earth and gritty as you can possibly get. So I appreciate that element of it.
Yeah, I think the less we say about Zero Year, the better. But I think I agree. I appreciate the grittiness of it, and I think you can kind of see when you read it why it's been so influential to live action filmmakers. And I also think one thing that I really really like about it is the mood. And I think I've mentioned this before that the character works best as a noir crime fighting detective, not so much leaning into the sci-fi elements of it that some of the more modern stories tend to do. And I think this really embraces the street level roots and the detective aspect of the character, which I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, I would agree with both of that. And the thing I think that kept popping in my head as I was rereading it, I really focused on the art and that I loved the art and the whole style and feel, the grittiness, the noirish elements. It reminded me a lot. It felt like I was watching or reading, in a way, a Batman-infused novelization of Taxi Driver or something. Just that mood with the colors and everything, and it feels like it's very rainy and dour, and that's just kind of the vibe I was feeling with. So I really enjoyed that element of it, I like the way it expands upon, Bruce Wayne's, first year as Batman and brings that into focus while still respecting the original origin. There's a couple panels in there that, are recreations of panels that were in the first origin told, for Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, so I liked that, seeing those appear there, just that little motif that celebrates and then kind of does its own very 80s modern Frank Miller-esque spin on it. But what are some things you didn't like about it?
Let's see. It does kind of meander a little bit, maybe in the middle. There's not much action to it. There's only probably two big kind of set pieces, if you want to call them, the fight that he has with the cops, and then at the end when he's not even dressed as Batman. He's just wearing the motorcycle helmet, and Gordon's chasing after, finding his kid and stuff. So yeah, I would say it's kind of not. It meanders is the word I would use.
Yeah, I think it doesn't feel like a complete story to me. It kind of ends really really abruptly, and it does its job in terms of introducing the character, like, okay, this is the first time he appears as Batman, but then it doesn't really do much else. And so that's, I think, something that I would say I dislike. The other thing that I would also mention, and this might be controversial because I'm kind of 50-50 on it, is the art in the book. There are some panels that are outstanding, and then there are others that are not really so well done, in my opinion. And so that would be something that I would say I kind of am on the fence about.
Interesting. Do you have any like particular panels that come to mind?
So the ones that I like, obviously, you know, the scene where he comes in to the dinner and interrupts them during the dinner. I think that one's absolutely fantastic. The scene in the study really focuses in on the eyes, but there's some, especially in the action sequences, I'm not sure that's Mazzucchelli's forte in terms of drawing those and sort of storyboarding how that happens. But the thing is too, like, there are some panels where even in action sequences where he does well, so it just feels a bit uneven to me.
I wonder if go ahead, BJ.
Sorry. Well, because I know this is one of those stories that like always gets reprinted, and I feel like the art's like always updated and re-inked, and I wonder if maybe like depending on like your copy, like it might look differently or better. Like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I do have a more modern reprinting, because in the back of the collection that I have, there are pages that are like samples, I think, from the original printing, and the coloring does look different. So I wonder if that might have anything to do with it. But in the copy I have, it does look a bit uneven.
It's an interesting point, though, because I wish I actually looked at the print date for the volume I was reading, but the copy I have is at least 20 years old, I want to say. It still has the DC Bullet Shield logo on it. So I know, it's pretty old now, because that was like 2 logos ago. But yeah, that's interesting. But I do think I kind of hear what you're saying with some of the action scenes, because I do remember at least a few of them, they felt like, I don't know, uneven is a word I want to say. Not every action scene, but just, it's kind of enjoying the moodiness, and then there was this brief action that felt just out of place, or just maybe uneven, or maybe not kinetic is the word I'm really thinking of, where there wasn't that flow there to like really draw me in and pull it. But there's nothing that overtly stood out to me that I necessarily had an adverse reaction to, though. It's just probably very, very minor nitpicky things for me at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I wouldn't say the art is bad or anything. I think it's just I think it's because in some pages and in some panels, the standard is at a certain level. I'm expecting that in all the pages, and maybe that's a bit unrealistic. So I think it's failing at its own standards sometimes. And then there's little things too that, I mean, this is not really about art, but so at the end of the book, he gets shot, right? And then instead he takes off after a truck and a car on a bicycle.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. Actually, in my head, when he hopped on that bicycle, I thought of like the Pee-wee's Big Adventure music or something, like with the bike chase at the end, because it was kind of silly. But I also feel like that's kind of like Frank Millerisms right there, as I like to call them. And that's something I put on here because it is an element I dislike, is that I like a lot of Frank Miller's works, and I think he's a good writer. He's art, depends on which book it is. It could be terrible and it could be pretty good. But he has weird just views and things he likes to put in there. We'll talk about one of the major characters later, but I did want to point out Sarah Essen, because the way he describes her, or he has Gordon describe her, is that she's a woman who knows how to wear heels still, and there's like this whole thing about like how that's not common anymore, and like he really leans into it.
That's Batman, right? Like when Gordon sets a trap for him.
Yeah. But then like at the same token, later on, it's also noted that she's like too masculine for other careers, and that's why she's a cop. And so it's this weird like push-pull, and it's something I've noticed where like maybe Frank Miller doesn't express it that explicitly in a lot of his works, but it's just like a thing that like pops up in like other works like Sin City, and it's just interesting.
There's a very long conversation to be had on Frank Miller writing female characters.
But speaking of Sarah Essen, I've seen that a lot of people, and actually in our Discord too, with certain members of the staff, Jim Gordon's cheating is sometimes considered a point of contention. But I would ask you guys if you guys think serves a narrative purpose here.
I guess to show that he's flawed. I know this is kind of like a Millerism, like having the hero be flawed. It is. I don't know what purpose it serves, just to show that Gordon's not that perfect cop and he's maybe just as corrupt as, the rest of the GCPD, which shows how this book's kind of all about how corrupt they are with Flass and everybody and Commissioner Loeb. So, while he's always trying to be the perfect cop, but he's a good cop, but like not a good man almost.
So I think this is connected to the archetype of the hero. And this is also connected to why I think DC or Warner Brothers have failed to make a good Superman movie for so long, is because for some reason now there seems to be some sort of hesitancy about doing a character that is purely heroic. And I understand that you don't want to write every character that way, because that can get boring very quickly. And it's also not realistic, because not every person is purely heroic. And if everyone was, then it would cease to be special. And so from that standpoint, I feel like that element for Gordon in this story was included just to sort of shy away from the purely heroic character. And I think, as BJ said, that is a Millerism. He does shy away from pure heroic characters. What I will say is that I will say that it is used well in this story because it's not meant to be something that's good. Like, it's clearly portrayed as something that's negative. It's clearly portrayed as a flaw. It's not promoting that kind of thing and saying, hey, that's great, you can go do that. So it is a character flaw. But then the other thing too, the second part of that, is that it shows how someone can rectify that flaw, which is what he does throughout the story. And I think that's also compelling, and that's also another form of heroism, is kind of owning up, taking accountability for mistakes, owning up to it, and seeking a path to rectify it, which is what he does. And I think for people who are in similar situations, they might be able to see that and be like, well, this is something that I can do, or that's something that they can connect to, which I think is also important, because, as I said, like, if every character is purely heroic, then that would be very boring, and it would also be unrealistic.
I think that was very well said. And it's I feel similarly in that, considering the subject matter, they could have been way more graphic about it or overt, but I feel like there was a lot of restraint in that subplot, especially when compared to a lot of Frank Miller's other works. Like, and there was that tenderness there not to like totally damage Gordon's character. And so, it is this mark, but it does bring in the adult conversation, kind of like you're talking about, of being able to address it and, rectify it and deal with it and do the right thing, after that act of betrayal. And so it's something I actually appreciated. And it's interesting because I feel like it only really lives in this book. It's not something that ever comes up again outside of this. And this was published after The Killing Joke, and granted, while it's an origin story and takes place before that, most stories that deal with any sort of moral, shadows or walking a line with Gordon usually fall into the camp of, well, the Killing Joke happened, so, he's going back and forth on whether he thinks the Joker should die or wants to kill the Joker. I was actually reading an annual from 1992 last night that dealt with this again, and obviously we saw it in a recent Joker maxi series from James Tynion not too long ago. But it just feels like, it's a different thing that can mar Gordon, but also allow that room for, maybe a more developed or nuanced character. And the restraint is appreciated. And I like that, it allows us to still like and root for Gordon. Obviously, if it was done differently, we probably would have despised or loathed him in a way.
And I think also that restraint that you mentioned is key in terms of how it's portrayed, because I think if someone was to do that type of storyline today in 2024, it would be played for graphic shock value. I mean, maybe not 100% of the time, but there's a good chance that it would be. And that would not be showing restraint. And then I think that would just make it more controversial and feel more like a character assassination. I don't think the way that they did it here is in any way a type of character assassination of Gordon.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. So the other character I wanted to talk about, and it is a point of the story I don't like, and I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts first, but Catwoman. Is she a character in here or a non-character?
Oh boy, that's like a to be or not to be type of question there. I guess she's a cat. Maybe once she puts on that the Catwoman costume, she's a character. But all I could think about going over this was the first time Bruce and Selina meet is Tom King's run, where we met. It was the street, it was the boat, it was the street, it was the boat. That's all I could think of first when I rereading this and watching the movie again. But yeah, I guess speaking of backstories that DC has shied away from. Catwoman's career before she became Catwoman, they've kind of gone away from that. Although they do bring it back a little bit in the Batman, but yeah, I feel like they'll never mention her past career as in any comics.
I think the answer to this question is actually connected to a question you asked before, and it's this story meanders, is what BJ said, and this is part of that meandering. Is that Catwoman doesn't need to be in this story. She's included. I guess my perception of it is that she's included to sort of show the quote unquote on the street perspective, like what's happening, how Gotham appears to be for people in a certain neighborhood from a certain socioeconomic bracket. That's the perspective that we're supposed to be getting with her, and it's supposed to be a counter, I think, to Batman's rich or privileged, or the rich and privileged elites that you see in that dinner scene in Gotham. I'm not sure it needs to be in there. I don't see much value in it in the story. I think it's part of the reason the story meanders. I think Miller just included it because, as you mentioned, this is coming right after Dark Knight Returns, and there was a brief Catwoman scene in there in which he also doesn't know what to do with her in that book too, because she just kind of comes into the story just to be victimized, and then we never really hear from her again, except at the funeral later on. So yeah, I didn't think she needed to be in here.
She goes back to the same career that Dark Knight Returns as she started in year one.
In management now, though.
Yeah. But yeah, that's just something I was thinking about because, it's interesting because I remember her in it. But, when I thought of well, what's the plot of this? I just remember her just being in the book, but not really being much a part of the plot. And that seems to be, that's my reading again, is that she's here. And I feel like, there are allusions to Batman and Catwoman having some kind of future together. There's scenes with cats around Batman and Bruce, Wayne. They pop up in there, and I saw that as foreshadowing. This is eventually they're going to have this connection, this push pull. But that's kind of all I got out of it, which is she's there. They have this. They have this because you're a Batman fan, and here's their origin story. In a way.
Yeah, and just quickly, I mean, we're going to talk about the animated adaptation later, but just one brief mention that I thought was really funny is, that scene where she's sleeping and then Holly's looking out the window and, she wakes up and it's 5 a.m. She's like, what's going on? There are bombs literally being dropped out her window. She doesn't wake up because of that, but then she wakes up because of the cats. I just thought that was hilarious.
So, speaking of the animated film, we can move on to that because I actually forgot that this came out. I did watch it again. It was an animated adaptation in 2011. Ben McKenzie played Batman, and he would famously go on to play Jim Gordon in the Gotham TV show. Bryan Cranston played Jim Gordon. Eliza Dushku played Selena Kyle. There's obviously other cast members, but those are your three core. But on this topic, I kind of want to have an open floor. What your thoughts are on it. Do you think it's a faithful adaptation?
I would definitely say it's faithful because it's basically like a shot-for-shot remake of the story. And I think that's why I really don't like it. I'm sure we're gonna go there, but just kind of, it's too much of a shot-for-shot remake where they don't take advantage of, they don't add their own little flavor or add anything to like the fight scenes or anything. It's just what you see on the page is what you see on the screen, and I think that's why it's kind of forgettable.
Yeah, I have the same take. I think it is quite literal. Like I had my book, and I finished reading it right before I watched it, and I watched it right before we got on. And I had my book open, and I'm going through, and it's, as BJ said, literally shot for shot. I would say 99% of what's in the book is in the adaptation. There's some minor differences, like that funny bicycle scene I mentioned earlier. Instead of a bicycle, he's running on rooftops doing some parkour to catch up. So there's just little tweaks like that that I think they've made, because some parts of it also haven't aged as well, and so they've made changes in that way. But it's literally like a shot for shot remake of the book. And what's interesting too is, like, I think while there are many people who would find that kind of, boring, and I kind of agree with BJ on that, like I need to see a little bit more. There are some people, there are some people on the server especially that I know who would be like, this is perfect. We want a exact shot for shot remake, and that's all we want. So, I mean, I guess it just depends on who you are.
Yeah. It's a good way to put it. It has its audience, but I'm kind of in your guys' camp where I watched it, I was bored. And I remember when I watched it the first time, I was excited because Bryan Cranston was voicing Jim Gordon. I'm like, oh, that'll be neat. And then I watched, and then, I was equally bored, and it never left my DVD case till this past week. So, and it'll probably go back there and I'll forget about it.
They definitely learned, because the next year they had the Dark Knight Returns 2-part, and you can't really talk about year one without talking Dark Knight Returns. And while a lot of Dark Knight Returns, the movies adapted faithfully from the story, they move little pieces around, but like the action, like the set pieces in Dark Knight Returns is so much grander in scale. Obviously, he fights Superman at the end, but they add so much more to that fight where it is a little more memorable. Like when he fights the mutant leader, when he has the fight with the Joker in the Tunnel of Love, like they add a lot to it, but it keeps it with the core of the story. And I don't know how about you guys, but I really like that 2-part of Dark Knight Returns, the animated films. And I think that's why I wonder if they definitely learned like a lesson from year one when they made that movie.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. And I think the voice acting performances in that one were way better than the voice acting performances in this one. And it was weird because I know that sometimes for these adaptations, the voice actors, they record all their lines separately. But I feel like it was really noticeable in this, where it felt like at times they were not even interacting or talking to each other, and these lines were just cut, copy and pasted into the adaptation. Whereas in Dark Knight Returns, it felt like the characters were all in the same room recording at the same time, and that might not have been the case. But I think that's a sign of a good voice acting performance, is that they have you believe that.
Oh yeah, for sure. There was emotion in the Dark Knight Returns adaptation with a lot of the voice acting, and in this, it's just it feels
so monotone.
Yeah,
so monotone.
It feels like you're getting like a foreign film that they dubbed over, and like the people they just hired were like there for the day, and like I gotta bang these out, whatever. Yeah. So, but I think we're all in agreement on how we feel about it. We can move on because the next part I find a little more exciting, and it's kind of the influences this story has had in other pieces of Bat media. I'll start with one movie, and I can stop and you guys can put your thoughts on it. And, I have a list of 3 movies here, but there obviously could be other ones that I'm not even thinking of. This was a quick list I put together, but Batman Begins is like the most obvious one. I feel like there is a Detective Flass in the movie as he is in the book. Very different interpretations of this character in look and, background, but both Detective Flasses are crooked cops and they have a connection to Falcone. And they're also Gordon's partner. Commissioner Loeb is also in the Dark Knight trilogy. And Batman Begins ends like year one, with that reference to the Joker, of things to come. And one thing I will add, I mentioned that there were other year one stories made throughout the year or throughout the years. And this particular movie sparked DC to release both Batman Ra's al Ghul year one and Batman Scarecrow year one, of which I don't really remember Ra's al Ghul too much, but I did overall enjoy the Scarecrow. It's not a must read, but for what it was, I did enjoy it.
I would say the biggest thing that Batman Begins lifted from year one was the scene where Batman calls the bats to escape. That's one of the best parts of the book and the movie, really. And I remember when I first, because I saw Begins before I read year one, and when the Flash in Batman Begins, I thought was Harvey Bullock, because he's kind of overweight, kind of goofball, and they're calling him Flash, and I was like, "That's not Flash. Who? Like, I don't know what a Flash is, but that's Harvey Bullock." But then I get it. Then I read the story, and I was like, "All right, they kind of just took the name and took the likeness and combined them." But yeah,
There's a bunch of even the Dark Knight ends. It's kind of like year one, where like in the Dark Knight he saves Gordon's kid and kind of falls. That's how this one ends too. Like he's falling off a bridge to save Gordon's kid. So there's that as well. The shot of the diner, just the panel of it. I think it's supposed to look like a famous American painting. I do not know which one it is, but I've seen it before. I know it by sight.
Nighthawks, I believe, is the one you're talking of.
I'll take your word for it, Scott, because I have no idea which one it is. If I see the picture, I know it, but I don't know the name or the artist. But it's that they used a similar type of shot in the Batman as well, where Riddler was hiding out. When Batman in year one, when he goes out into the street for the first time, that costume's kind of similar to the Drifter costume from the Batman as well. So there's multiple live action films, and I would say all the best live action films have drawn from this story.
I think that's a really good point. And yeah, to that end, the things you're mentioning, I didn't even have on my list. The other things I did have were Dark Knight, Harvey Dent takes credit for being Batman, which I saw as kind of a nod to them thinking Harvey Dent was Batman in year one, and then obviously the Batman, there is the diner references. And I feel like kind of the theme of that movie, does lift, quite a bit from this. And, it's interesting because I feel like I kind of like these movies as better year one stories than Batman year one, in the sense that, and I think the difference is they've really kind of leaned more into Gotham City and Batman's world, and that's why I prefer it. Whereas like we're talking about how we feel year one is a good story, but it feels incomplete. These movies, they have some kind of grand escalation involving one or two of Batman's rogues gallery at some point, that really kind of makes it feel that more grand scale, storytelling that incorporates this and builds on it, and to the Batman's credit, we've talked about this to death in a lot of our episodes when the movie came out, but like all those things have an impact on him as a character. He has to make a change by the film's end, and it's something I really appreciate. And I will mention too, going with the Batman, another year one book came out of that one. So they followed the whole Batman Begins plot line where DC was like, hey, you want to do another year one? And so Paul Dano, who played the Riddler, helped write a Riddler year one book, which isn't canon, but goes into the backstory of the villain from the film.
It's pretty awesome too. I do really like that story.
Yeah, it is really good. I really like it, and I kind of wish we can get Paul Dano on the podcast to talk about it. And the movie.
You have Twitter. Can we tag him on Twitter?
But are there any other references that we missed that you can think of?
In the Dark Knight, in the daytime, he goes out on the motorcycle like he does at the end of year one with the helmet. In Mask of the Phantasm, he fights the cops. Those are the only two I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think those are the only two other ones.
It's still a pretty big list. So, kind of to recap, the big question here is, does Batman Year One fit in your reading essentials for Batman?
I would definitely say it is essential, even though it's not one of my favorites. I wouldn't put it in my personal top 10, but I would say it is essential. It's where everything started, basically.
I agree. Like, it's not one of my favorites, but it is like if I'm creating a list of collected edition stories and I'm presenting it to someone and saying, if you want to get into Batman, or if you are just getting into Batman and you want to kind of read some of the foundational or classic stories, this is going to be one of them. So yes, I would say it is part of that list.
Okay, and so to piggyback off of that, if you're giving someone a list of reading essentials of Batman, is Year One the first book you give them, or do you tuck it in there? Because I actually have strong feelings on that, but I want to hear your take on that first.
Give it to someone to start. I think a couple years ago at work, someone asked me like, "Oh, like I'm into Batman. Like, what should I start reading?" And I did say I had him read The Long Halloween first, because I was like, "Here you go. You got Batman, and you have the entire Rogues Gallery, and it's an awesome story." And I let him off of that one. I didn't even start with Year One.
So how I would approach it is, I think everyone's different. I don't think there's any single list or recommendation that works for everyone. And so if I'm trying to bring someone into the fan base, or I'm trying to encourage someone to get into a new character, I would think about that person and the stories that they like and recommend something that's along those lines. So for example, if they're into more sci-fi futuristic tech stuff, I might recommend like a really great Batman Beyond story as a way to kind of get them in. And once they're in, and once they have that interest and enjoyment in the character, then I kind of would give them this and be like, hey, so this is kind of the one, this is considered a classic, and this is where it's, everything kind of started for the character. And then, then they'd have the interest in reading it, whether they're really into it or not. If it's someone who is very into, gritty noir detective style stories, then yeah, I would start them off with this one, or this would be one of the ones that I start them off with.
That's really an interesting thing to consider, and I think you're right in that. When I say that, I think lately I've been recommending Hush as a starting point, partially because I want to recommend Long Halloween, but that one I feel like is much better than Hush. Not to say Hush is bad, but I like it better, and I feel like Hush is one of those, the mystery isn't that complicated or like hidden. And I feel like if you put that too far in the list, it might be disappointing, to like read that later and read all these other great stories first. And then it's like one of those like escalating expectations. But, yeah, you're right. Depending on what they're into, or, where they're coming from, Year One might make the sensible starting location.
And that's the nice thing about this character too, is that Batman, over the 80 years plus that he's been in print, has proven to be very versatile. So at this point, there are stories for everyone that everyone can connect to and enjoy. And so it just comes down to, I think, knowing the person that you're giving the recommendation to. And then once they're hooked, once they're in, then you can kind of give them, okay, these are the classics, and then they might have, the interest to go outside of the stories that they might only be interested in reading and try something new.
It's funny too. Like I always see like those lists, like best bat books for beginners, and usually one of the top ones is like Dark Knight Returns. I'm like, you can't lead off with Dark Knight Returns. Like it's literally the end of his career, basically, and like why start there? That's so weird when I see those on lists.
It's also
some like horrible buzz.
Yeah, and it's also like a depressing moment for the character. I don't think that's like the best time to start them off with.
Yeah, it's kind of like introducing them to the Marvel Universe and giving them Old Man Logan.
yeah, for real.
But that said, I have the last two questions I have. I'm going to combine them. I have them separate here, but are there any year one books that make your essential readings list that you'd recommend people, like other year one books? And the extra caveat to that is, are there year one stories that haven't been made that you'd like to see? Or are you tired of the concept and hope they stop after Joker year one?
So one's to essential year one stories. Well, I'm a big Robin Dick Grayson's my favorite character, so I would maybe say Robin year one. But other than that, Batgirl year one is great too. If you want to start there for essential readings like that. I don't know. I know Frank Miller wrote Superman year one. I haven't read it, but I haven't heard good things. Can't really think of any other essential year one stories.
I have not read the Robin or Batgirl year one, and I intend to do so because that seems like a pretty glaring hole in my reading resume. I do think there's some, like, I guess, like, would the Batman Beyond movie be counted as Batman Beyond year one? Like it's not officially year one, but it's kind of like an origin for him, I think. I think it would be good if the main characters all had some sort of definitive year one story. But at the same time, I feel like, as you mentioned, Scott, with the sheer number of year one stories that have been published in the years since this book came out in like 1986, I feel like they're all chasing that magic. They're all chasing the magic of Batman year one, and none of them are quite hitting it. And I think it's partially because they're chasing the magic instead of just trying to do it.
Yeah, I think so.
22 because like John Byrne's like Man of Steel came out around this time, and like I would almost consider that like a Superman year one, but it's not called year one. But that's like one of like the great like origin stories, I think, for Superman, even though it's not considered a year one.
I think it's hard too because I don't want to go too much into the Joker year one thing. We also just had Gotham City year one, and part of me feels like the year one label kind of gets slapped on things sometimes where maybe it doesn't belong. And that worries me, and if now we're going to start taking like cities or locations and just slapping year one on there, maybe we should do a clock tower year one or something. But I don't know. I think if it's done right, I like the concept of it, but I see it as a very specific thing where it's kind of a celebration and introductory read, or should be, for the character. So like those like Batgirl, Robin, Nightwing, like, I tend to enjoy those as like kind of the quick rough history and kind of get into it. And if that were how they were going to continue all to be, I wouldn't mind seeing more villain ones, but maybe like, I don't know, maybe the expectations are, they don't have to be this massive, like, city-shattering plot. Maybe it could just be a really good, like, personal, emotional story. Something closer to the lines of, like, Scarecrow year one, where you take a villain or something, and it's just more so about them and who they are, I don't know. And I kind of like to see this as, like, a silly, maybe, like, do some that are a little goofier and less dour, where it's, like, I don't know, Scarface year one or something, just something strange that maybe could really go to bat for a small scale story that really just dives into that character in a fun kind of warm way. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling at this point.
No. I haven't read this series yet, but isn't that what One Bad Day was supposed to be?
I think there's more like they're almost Killing Joke type stories.
Okay.
Yeah, I read them all, and they were just kind of random.
They were hit and miss.
Yeah, some of them like really hit that vibe of trying to be the ultimate, like Clayface story or whatever. And then other ones kind of missed the mark. They just felt like a adult-rated, regular old, Batman adventure.
Yeah, I mean, I just think so many writers are trying to just replicate it. Like they go in with the intention of trying to replicate this instead of just being like, hey, I have this cool idea for a story and let's do it. And I think that's what you were referring to, is that there are many books that get the year one label slapped onto it that don't really deserve it in that way. And just another example, we brought up Zero Year earlier. That was literally a writer trying to replicate this with the same character. So that's how desperate people are, I think, to chase that magic.
True. Now we need Batman -1. But yeah, I think we kind of hit around the story as much as we could, as well as the related media. But I think and it's kind of interesting to see that we're all in agreement on how we feel about Batman Year One. It's good, it's worth your time, but maybe, not the best thing ever. And
it's funny that I think last time we were more positive about Batman and Robin than we were about Batman Year One. One story is universally beloved and the other is universally hated.
Now we need to have like Ian or Theo on to give a counterpoint.
Well, Theo's probably listening to all this, and he's going to send us some notes.
We like it. We don't love it. That's nothing wrong with that.
With that said, visit us at thebatmanuniverse.net for comic reviews, movie news, and more. Want to chat with us? You can hop on our Discord. A link will be below. You can also write to us at tbu@thebatmanuniverse.net, and we will respond to your comments on air. If you like these episodes, please subscribe, rate, and share. For BJ, Adil, and myself, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.